This is Tibet in the 1930s, a beautiful isolated land high up in the mountain range of the Himalayas, surrounded by the empires of Britain and China, and yet still almost completely untouched by the outside world. Tibet is now most famous for its leader, the Dalai Lama, who was forced into exile nearly 50 years ago. This treasure trove of rare colour films, filmed by British, Chinese and Tibetans who lived through these times, have been preserved by the British Film Institute. These films allow us to glimpse into a world which has almost entirely disappeared, to a time before the Dalai Lama and his people lost their country.
Oh, father. I think my father.
The Dalai Lama escaped to India in 1959 and, along with the Tibetan government in exile, is based in McLeodganj in northern India. To understand how Tibet was lost and why the Dalai Lama must live in exile, we have to look back to a time when Tibet was a free nation. This is Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, in the early 1940s. This film is of the main shopping street known as the Barkhor. Despite being shot in the 20th century, it looks medieval. Hardly surprising given its geographical position in the Himalayas. It was almost impossible to reach and so remained frozen in time. Namgyal Takla lived in Tibet in the 1940s.
We had the huge mountains surrounding Tibet, and then we were inside this mountain, isolated. And we had the big Russia, China, Britain around us. And it was the policy to be kept, this country to be kept a buffer state, a sort of a zone where the big powers will not meet. And it was, we lived in the 20th century, we maybe have lived like we were in the 16th century.
Originally nomadic, Tibetan society became feudal and deeply religious. The introduction of Buddhism to Tibet had a profound effect on both its culture and traditions. Ruled by a dual system combining aristocratic families and Buddhist monks, the government's main function was to maintain the religious state. Any attempts to modernise or invite foreign influence were resisted by this conservative and profoundly religious outlook. Life in Lhasa was dominated by a huge number of religious festivals, which involved most of the city's population. 68 days a year were taken up with these festivals. Since the Chinese occupation of Tibet, all of these festivals have been banned. Even though life for exiled Tibetans has changed enormously since the Chinese invasion, Tibetan culture is still deeply religious, and Buddhism is central to its way of life. Tibetan prayer flags still hang in holy places. Each time the wind blows, the prayers that are written on them are released into the universe. Buddhism arrived in Tibet in the 7th century, 1,000 years after it began in India. Focusing on the attainment of a deep understanding into the true nature of life, all Buddhists believe that the path to true enlightenment is through the practice and development of morality, meditation and wisdom. At the time these films were made, monks made up 20% of the male Tibetan population. Every Tibetan family, rich or poor, sent their youngest son to a monastery as a spiritual and religious duty. Because monks had a higher social status than peasants, poor families readily gave up their boys in the knowledge that they would be looked after financially for life. These boys would have just arrived at the monastery. Some were as young as 7. Even though in theory they could give up being monks if they wanted, they'd expect to stay there for the rest of their lives. In a tradition that dates back to the 17th century, the Dalai Lama, or Ocean of Wisdom, is both the spiritual and secular leader of Tibet. The present Dalai Lama, who is the 14th, was found while he was still a small child. All Buddhists believe in rebirth and reincarnation, but the man they refer to as His Holiness is something very special. Some even see him as a god king. He is the reincarnation of all the previous Dalai Lamas, an enlightened being, the bodhisattva of compassion, who returns to the human world to help others. When the 13th Dalai Lama died, his reincarnation, a 3-year-old boy called Tenzin Gyatso, was found, some 600 miles from the capital, in Amdo, a province in the far northeast, close to the Chinese border. While the Western world was at war, Tenzin and his family made the long journey to Lhasa. The 14th Dalai Lama arrived in October 1940. By now, he was 5 years old. He was accompanied by his father, mother, and 2 elder brothers, Lobsang Santen and Gyalu Thondup.
Oh, father. I think my father. Father, yes. Oh, my mother. Oh, this is elder brother, whom I bully. My mother, very, very gentle. Almost I never saw her sort of the mental state of temper. I never saw. Very gentle. Always smile. Something very, very nice woman. A villager, uneducated. At the beginning, illiterate. Later, with her own effort, she can read some books. Now here, yes, my father with mustache. He very much interest keep his mustache very, very organized way. No, not like that. So he used, of course, our family from time to time eating meat with bone. So every time from the bone there is something what called marrow or something. Oh, so see, he usually used to put on his mustache, then do like that.
From the moment the young Dalai Lama was found, he was revered as a god king. While he was their religious leader, he would not become head of state until he reached 18, and years of monastic study lay ahead of him. The balance of power between the government and the religious elite was maintained through the ceremonies and rituals that dominated life in Tibet. The strict adherence to protocol is clearly illustrated by the Mulam Chenmo, or Great Prayer Festival, a series of events which commemorates the day when Buddha preached the Dharma, or sacred text, for the first time. The festival starts when the monks take over the running of Lhasa from the government. The proctors of the Drepung monastery arrive carrying heavy silver maces to demand that power is handed over to them by the Kashag, or parliament. The proctors are accompanied by the Dobdobs, or monastic police, huge monks who carry long sticks and whips. The head Dobdob carries the biggest stick, of course. Wearing padded robes, their cheeks blackened, their job is to intimidate and control the crowd of 20,000 monks who flood the city for the festival. Gifts of money and food were handed out during the Great Prayer. Most of them were funded by the Tibetan government. At the end of the festival, power was handed back to the government, which was dominated by a group of aristocratic families. There were about 200 families who made up the civil service, and each of them had to provide a son to serve as an official. Within the aristocracy, there were 30 higher status families who had the most senior positions. Namgyal Takla is from one of these families, the Tsarongs.
Oh, that's our house, the house I was born in, the Tsarong house. And that's my aunt, Kukula, and that's my mother. They're really modeling away. It seems quite strange that they are modeling, because there's never even heard of this in Tibet, nor did anybody do that, you know. It seems quite strange. I'm sure Auntie Kukula must have arranged this. And I don't know who took the picture, but it's very beautiful, very beautiful.
The 5-year-old Dalai Lama was about to lead, spiritually if not politically, the massive civil and monastic bureaucracy within Lhasa. Before his official enthronement, he stayed at the summer palace, the Norbalinka. At first, his family were also allowed to stay there, before he began his new life.
Of course, at that time, my mother and father and my other brother remain or stay with me. Then mother and father, I think every day is to come to see me. And also I also visited to their home. I enjoy my native village's food.
While pilgrims flocked from all over Tibet to be blessed by their god king, he received important international visitors, and it was customary to bear gifts. The British political officer in nearby Sikkim brought a movie camera with him and managed to get this first ever moving picture of the Dalai Lama. Sir Basil Gould, seen here with the white prayer scarf around his neck, also brought an expensive foreign toy car for the little boy. But already his status set him apart from other children, and only his older brother Lobsang was allowed to test drive it.
Oh, this is my brother, elder brother. So the people felt if I handle maybe too risk, so my elder brother, let him, you see, play. Sometimes I feel a little jealousy.
Somebody's in the car. I wonder if that is my husband. It's him?
Namgyal married the Dalai Lama's older brother Lobsang in 1962, after he had given up being a monk. The date for the 14th Dalai Lama's enthronement ceremony at the Potala Palace was reached according to complex astrological calculations. The distance between the Norbalinka Palace and the Potala is only a few miles. The Dalai Lama would be accompanied on this short journey by the whole of his monastic and civil retinue. The 13-storey palace was built in the 7th century. A quarter of a mile long with over 1,000 rooms, it covered the whole of Lhasa's Red Hill. It was the winter residence of the Dalai Lama, a place of religious worship and training, as well as being the centre of the Tibetan government and its huge civil service. Tenzin Gyatso was enthroned as the 14th Dalai Lama on the 22nd of February 1940. A life of austerity and strict scholarly pursuit began for 5-year-old Tenzin and his brother Lobsang. While the boy studied, a monk regent took the role of Tibet's temporal leader until the Dalai Lama reached the age of majority. Regent Retting, accompanied by his enormous bodyguard, a Tugba, oversaw much of this power vacuum. But his regime was seen as corrupt. He was displaced and then eventually imprisoned after an attempted coup. He died in jail. While the young Dalai Lama had to wait to take full political power, as the country's spiritual leader, he acted as a figurehead, and one of his duties was attending cabinet meetings. His strict routine only varied when there were important festivals to attend. The festival of the votive offering took place in the eastern courtyard of the Potala Palace. It was a deeply significant, solemn occasion in which all of the sins and bad events from the previous year were purged, clearing the way for the next. The yellow-hatted monks of the Dalai Lama's own Namgyal monastery arrive, and they join the government and civil officials as they prostrate themselves in front of His Holiness. Watching from the top floor, whose balconies are hidden behind yellow silk awnings, is the Dalai Lama. The main event is the Chum, a tantric dance. Accompanied by drums and trumpets, dancers of the Dalai Lama's monastery descend the stairs and enter the courtyard. They have spent many hours in meditation, envisaging themselves as the deities they are about to perform. The Chum dance for the votive offering is performed on the last day of the Tibetan calendar. The monks who dance the Chum will have spent years in training, not only in the steps and movements of the dance, but also in the inner meaning of each gesture. The principal character, the stag, is danced by a young monk aged 12 or 13. Ringed around him are 22 black hat dancers and 16 masked dancers. The dance is performed as an auspicious ritual to bring good fortune for the coming new year, and to clear away all negative elements from the last. At the end of the ceremony, a cathartic fire purification rite is performed. A human skull filled with alcohol is poured into a pot of burning oil, and the last traces of evil are dispelled. Tibetan Buddhism differs from other types because it has its roots in the earlier Bon religion. This brings with it a belief in gods and celestial beings, as well as various traditions that involve all of Tibetan society. Tibetans believe that their prayers are given added power by being conducted by a prayer wheel. Prayer wheels can contain up to a mile of written prayers. They are symbolically recited with every turn. Pilgrims earn merit and concentrate their minds on the mantras they are reciting as they turn the wheel. The circular 5-mile holy walk which surrounded Lhasa was known as the Lingkhor. On festival days like the anniversary of the Buddha's enlightenment, pilgrims would start early in the morning. Many would give money, tea or food to the beggars who would line the route. Artemisia, scrub rhododendron and juniper twigs were burnt, and the air would be filled with incense. Some pilgrims would prostrate themselves. Prostration is a spiritual act where pilgrims move forward, ritually laying their bodies on the ground. Forwards prostration would take a pilgrim about 6 or 7 days to complete the whole route. A new Lingkhor has been created in MacLeod to replace the sacred path lost in Lhasa. And while pilgrims don't prostrate themselves on the Lingkhor anymore, people still give money to beggars. These days, however, the beggars are Indians, and the pilgrims giving money are Tibetan refugees. The cabinet and senior civil officials also walk the Lingkhor on festival days. But they would get very hot in their heavy ceremonial costumes, and so would stop off at the British mission for a cup of tea. Historically, the British and Chinese were officially represented in Tibet. British pressure to allow trading had led to the establishment of a new British trade mission in 1937, and in the mid-1940s, a Chinese representative arrived in Lhasa. Relations with the British were cordial, while they were more tense with the Chinese. Dr. Sung Lien Shen is seen here being welcomed by Jigme Tering, the Tibetan finance minister. Although they shared a religion, Buddhism, as a Chinese nationalist, Shen considered Tibet to be part of China. Aside from diplomatic toing and froing, life in Lhasa continued according to ancient custom and practice. The Dalai Lama lived in the Potala during the winter and the Norbalinka during the summer. Twice a year, the civil and religious hierarchy accompanied him on his move from palace to palace. identified by the peacock-feathered umbrella which accompanied his sedan chair or palanquin, the whole population of Lhasa watched silently for a glimpse of His Holiness.
Oh, that young monk, I think out of curiosity, looking. In any case, from my childhood, from that age, I always smile with people, with public. So people also, you see, love my smile. So whenever I look like that, the people express some kind of, expression of overjoys. I think around 10 years old, around 10, when I look this, I feel the people consider, or the reincarnation of High Lama. But actually that young boy, I think only play how to play. So there is big contrast.
The King's New Year festival celebrates the Dalai Lama's position as the ruler of both church and state. The high officials have robes dating back to the 7th century, wearing ancient ornaments of amber and coral, which had been traded along the Silk Route. They had originally come from the Mediterranean. The turquoise charm boxes around their necks and the golden bar encased in turquoise which reaches their waist is so heavy it must be carried. The ordinary people of Lhasa gather at the foot of the potala to watch the sky dancing, a spectacle in which a man scales a rope up to a tall wooden mast, stands precariously on a small platform and then spins himself around on it. The performer is traditionally a man from one of the small villages in the region of Tsang. It's done in retribution for their resistance to the rule of the 5th Dalai Lama in the 17th century. There is a saying in Tsang that mothers do not die from illnesses, but from worry that their sons might be taken for the sky dance. The casting out of the votive offering was one of the biggest and most elaborate of the year's celebrations. This ceremonial representation of a military manoeuvre was known as the coiling snake. Then hundreds of monks arrive carrying green drums and cymbals. Next, the torma are brought out, tall sculptures which have grinning skulls on top and represent evil. A monk, chosen for his psychic powers, known as the Nechung Oracle, appears in a state of possession and rushes through the crowd. The oracle is dressed in an elaborate costume, including a heavy harness and a huge helmet. The costume is so heavy that the medium can hardly walk in it when he is not in his trance-like state. He races around chaotically, chasing the tormas or evil spirits into a clearing, accompanied by hundreds of monks and most of the population of Lhasa. When the oracle arrives, he shoots a burning arrow into bonfires, which contain the tormas, and they are set ablaze. Many of the religious festivals had an additional civil or governmental element. At the review at Trapchi, the Tibetan cavalry assemble for a ceremonial march past in front of the cabinet and other government officials. The cavalry are dressed in chain mail, steel breastplates and helmets with peacock feathers on them. The standard bearers wear special helmets which have Allah inscribed on them in gold, thought to date back to 8th century contact with Arabs. They carry tall lances wrapped in painted banners, said to have been given by the army of Genghis Khan's grandson. The cabinet wear robes with a heavy fur collar and cuffs. Their fur-trimmed hats have silk crowns with gold and turquoise ornaments and a coral button on top. A government official, followed by 4 junior officials, makes his report to the cabinet, announcing the number of men and horses. The cavalry then march past the cabinet in ceremonial style. Summer in Lhasa was a time for festivals which both the rich and poor alike could enjoy. During the picnic season, most of the population would pitch tents in one of the parks southeast of the city. The tents ranged from the elaborate to a simple sheet. Famous Nangma musicians played Tibetan flutes and harmonicas for the picnickers. Incense-burning ceremonies were performed while monks sat in tents playing long horns and oboes. Even the Kuomintang government of China, who had a mission in Lhasa, joined in with the fun. While at home, the communists were growing in power and a civil war was raging. Another important summer event, and one of the Dalai Lama's favourites, was the annual opera festival held at the Norbalinka Palace. For the commoners of Lhasa, participation in some festival events was not really a matter of choice. For the wrestling and weightlifting, the contestants were from the Dalai Lama's personal bodyguard regiment, though it's hard to believe given their size and stature. The wrestling was a particularly unpopular duty, as they had to wear loincloths. It was deemed to be very shameful appearing semi-naked in public, and especially in front of your superiors. To preserve their dignity, minders would rush out to cover them. At the same time, a series of races were being conducted around the city. One of them was a foot race. A bit of a motley crew, they ranged from the very aged to the very young. They ran in brightly coloured outfits, somewhat unenthusiastically. The race was compulsory, performed as a duty to their landlords. For the Tibetan aristocrats, there were lots of social events to attend at the British Mission or Deki Linka. In true colonial style, tea parties were held. The British Mission closed when India gained independence in 1947. Tibet still had no status as an independent nation and was not recognised internationally. The civil war between the communists and the nationalists in China continued. The Tibetan government realised that if the communists won, they would not tolerate their religion. However, they did not want to be seen to be taking sides, so they politely asked the nationalist Chinese to leave Tibet. The small Tibetan army was reorganised, new regiments were formed, and they were re-equipped. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended, and the People's Republic of China was established under Mao Zedong's chairmanship. One of their first objectives was to bring Tibet back into the motherland. On the 6th of October 1950, 40,000 Chinese soldiers of the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet, and the small Tibetan army surrendered. Tibet appealed to the United Nations for help, but to no avail. Abandoned by the international community, the Tibetans had no course open to them but to negotiate with the Chinese. But they needed a sole ruler. So the 16-year-old Dalai Lama was made the spiritual and temporal leader of Tibet. The Dalai Lama acted quickly and sent delegations to Britain and America. But it was the height of the Cold War and the Allies refused to help. The Chinese, however, were happy to talk. Fearful that Chinese troops would invade Lhasa, the Dalai Lama instructed Tibetan officials in Beijing to begin negotiations. The 17-point agreement, in which Tibet was defined as being part of the Chinese motherland, was signed in Beijing without the Dalai Lama's consent. The long-awaited reunification, as the Chinese called it, was completed when their troops invaded Lhasa in October 1951. Professor Samdong Rinpoche was in Lhasa at the time.
At that time, there are quite a sizable number of Chinese military personnel arrived in Tibet, and they have set up loudspeaker radio in Lhasa town. So there was a lot of wires going over the houses, and there's a big loudspeaker. So it was not a radio, but just propaganda through a whole the town covered by the loudspeakers.
The 17-point agreement was meant to allow the Tibetan government to continue running its own country. So the Dalai Lama immediately set about introducing both social and land reforms. While he was attempting to propel Tibet into the 20th century, he still had ancient and highly demanding spiritual duties to perform. The Kala Chakra ceremony, or Wheel of Time, is one of the most complex systems of theory and practice of Tibetan Buddhism. The 17-year-old Dalai Lama was initiated into this tantric tradition in front of hundreds of officials and lay monks at the Norbalinka Palace.
I think this is the first time of Kala Chakra initiation at Norbalinka. I think 16, 17. I already, you see, took the responsibility of the Kasa, the temporal power.
In 1954, the Dalai Lama received an invitation from the Chinese to go to Beijing. While many Tibetans feared for his safety, the Dalai Lama was determined to go, seeing it as an opportunity to be able to talk to Chairman Mao in person.
Then I felt, not only me, but some officials, some high officials, now two opinions. One opinion, now this is right time, should go to Peking and meet high officials, high leaders. Then some very much reluctant, very much against. I think out of fear. And my own opinion is, now better go there.
The Tibetans were terrified at the thought of the Dalai Lama leaving the country, but he promised he would return within the year. Hundreds of people travelled from Lhasa and crowded the riverbanks to watch him leave and pray for his safe return.
Now this is actually, you see, departing Lhasa to China. I think this one. You know, I like missions or these modern things. So I love, you see, to visit China. But at the same time, not like just tourists, also have some responsibility. So not very certain. So all kinds of mixture feeling. Some hopes, some doubts, some fears, some, undecisive, like that. And also some excitement.
The Dalai Lama attended the first National Chinese People's Congress, which included 10 seats for the Tibetan delegation. He was impressed by Mao and felt a great affinity with many of the egalitarian principles of communism. However, at their last meeting, Mao gave his true opinion of Tibet and its future under Chinese rule. As the Dalai Lama left, Mao turned to him and said, "Religion is poison." The Dalai Lama returned to Tibet. News reached him that the Chinese authorities in the east were confiscating lands belonging to monasteries and redistributing them amongst themselves. Fighting broke out between the Chinese army and the Tibetan freedom fighters, and refugees began pouring into Lhasa. In the midst of this tense atmosphere, the Dalai Lama still had to take his final monastic exams. The main focus of the exams were public debates. Debate is an ancient tradition within Buddhism which is still practiced today, although the monks, and now nuns, are somewhat more vigorous in their style than they were in the 1950s. These monks are arguing over their personal interpretation of Buddhist texts. The skill is in arguing and using logic to back up your points with your own analysis, and involves constant re-evaluation. The points are punctuated with claps of the hand. The respondent must then reply with theirs. The culmination of the Dalai Lama's 18 years of study was an examination for a doctorate in Buddhist philosophy. This started with debates at 3 of the largest monasteries in Tibet. Drepung Monastery had 10,000 resident monks. 8,000 of them were squeezed into the square outside the main hall, to see the Dalai Lama as he arrived with his retinue to take his first exam. The monastery owned local estates and had some 20,000 Thai peasants who worked the land and paid them taxes. The revenue paid for the prayer sessions and festivals which dominated monastic life. Feeding the monks for big events like the examinations was a huge, if somewhat rushed, process. The young monks run down from the cookhouse carrying huge tubs of sampa to their brethren who are sitting in the square. Sampa, the staple diet of Tibetans, is made of roasted barley flour mixed with yak butter, tea or water to make dough. To celebrate His Holiness's presence, the monks are also given prayer scarves, tea and money.
I am somewhere here, somewhere among these, the second row or third row I should be, and this is a Goman side. These are the government officials. Now His Holiness is offering the debate to the two abbots. During his early life, he had to go to China, and he had to go to India, and he had so many things to attend. So then he did not have time to study.
Oh, now this abbot, top scholar, Mongolian, and also he, when he asked question very rapidly. So, a bit more nervous. So, I have had little opportunity to think how to trick to him. One top scholar, you see, very rapidly, you see, putting question, then no time, you see, how to pretend or how to defend like that. So now this is my turn. Debate.
Of course, we have received a lot of teaching from His Holiness, and we know he is a very great scholar. But he was not joined in the monastic debate. We thought he may not be very sharp in the in the debate. But for the first time, we saw when he was examined by the abbots, he was brilliant and absolutely sharp, equal with those who are debating the monastery for lifetime, and the abbots find it quite difficult to debate with him.
The next exam was at Sera Monastery. The whole of the Dalai Lama's government travelled with him, allowing him to consult with them about the growing tension in Lhasa. At the same time, he had to prepare for the next series of debates. But the abbots each had their own individual style of arguing. The last of the preliminary exams was some distance from Lhasa, at Ganden Monastery. Ironically, the examinations at Ganden proved to be a brief period of respite for the Dalai Lama. Thousands more refugees had fled the fighting in the east and had arrived in Lhasa. A huge number were now camped around the outskirts of the city. Tensions with the occupying Chinese were high. They had been in Tibet for some 9 years. There were food shortages in Lhasa and rumours about massacres in eastern Tibet and the destruction of sacred sites. The Dalai Lama's final exam was arranged to take place at the same time as the Molam New Year festival. There were 30,000 monks in the city, and pilgrims were arriving from all over the country. The Jokhang temple was full to bursting. The cabinet, civil officials and all of the senior abbots and monks were present. At the same time, the Chinese army had built gun emplacements on the rooftops. Soldiers carrying rifles were patrolling them.
There are a lot of rumors about danger to his security, and the threat perception was very high. And therefore it was very tight security arrangements used to be there, and that was a bit annoying, and that was not consonance with the monastic atmosphere. So a lot of soldiers with guns and very attentive and with walkie-talkies. These are not familiar with the people. So that was tense and also the joyful. These are going together.
One aspect, the whole atmosphere is so tense. Many people actually felt whether this big gathering can take place or not, because it is so much tense. But then everything go very smoothly. So everybody very happy. My final examination, successful. I think very successful. And also, I myself, from the corner of my mind, another thing is, now no more any lesson.
The Dalai Lama returned to the Norbalinka with his full retinue, but this time he was accompanied by armed guards. An invitation had arrived from the Chinese Governor-General of Tibet, inviting the Dalai Lama to see a dance troupe at the Chinese military headquarters. In the name of dispensing with formality, the Chinese requested that he attended with unarmed bodyguards. Worried that a refusal would worsen the fragile situation, the Dalai Lama accepted, but the news soon spread. Thousands of people rushed to the Norbalinka and surrounded the palace, demanding that the Dalai Lama didn't go. Intelligence reports reached him saying that the Chinese were about to bomb the palace. Convinced that if he left, the people would be saved, the Dalai Lama decided he had to leave.
Of course, I think topmost in my mind is fear, sadness, and almost like the feeling of desperate. And also leaving some of my close friends, sweepers or some monks who look after temples or the libraries in Norbalinka, and including my dog. So as a human level, very sad, one factor. Then also, several thousand Tibetan, you see, suppose different Norbalinka already gathered there. So that also additional worry. If something happens, then thousands of people will die. Then also, my own life, there is danger. One person's sort of future, but future of Tibet also is related. So therefore, anxiety, fear, little doubt, hesitation, and sadness, all mixed, very much mixed.
The Dalai Lama escaped from the Norbalinka that night, disguised as a Tibetan soldier.
The next day, reached southern Tibet. Then fear of my life, then no longer. Then we have no hesitation to criticize about our Chinese brothers sisters. While in Lhasa, although sometimes we criticize, but from one corner of our mind, oh, be careful, be careful, be careful, or that kind of sort of situation. Then as soon as we reach southern Tibet, the free from Chinese forces, we get some extraordinary feeling now, freedom.
2 weeks later, after an arduous journey through the Himalayas, the Dalai Lama reached safety in northern India. Within days, the Chinese systematically shelled the Norbalinka Palace, the Potala and the Jokang. The Tibetan resistance, made up of freedom fighters and monks who had taken up arms for the first time in their lives, were no match for the Chinese army. They surrendered after 3 days. The Tibetan government was abolished and the Chinese began to destroy Tibetan society and its Buddhist culture and traditions. Monasteries were looted and scriptures burnt. Nuns and monks were forced to denounce their faith, discard their robes. They were even forced to marry each other. Class resentment amongst the peasants over Tibet's feudal system was ruthlessly exploited. The government officials and aristocrats were imprisoned or forced to do menial jobs. They were subjected to public interrogation sessions, many resulting in death. The Indian government granted the Dalai Lama political asylum, and 80,000 refugees escaped from Tibet to join him. He has lived in Dharamsala, now known as Little Lhasa, ever since. The Dalai Lama appealed to the United Nations, calling on China to respect the human rights of Tibetans and their desire for self-determination. Despite 3 resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly, the fact that thousands of monasteries were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of Tibetans were imprisoned in labour camps, the international community refused to intervene.
Looking at these pictures that you have here in front of me, it's entirely a different world. And it was, to me, it's very sad. For instance, like my grandfather wanted Tibet. I get very emotional to talk about Tibet, you know. My grandfather wanted Tibet to be with the outside world and to join the United Nations, to educate the Tibetans outside and to be with the modern world. But his visions and his wishes, and also his 13th Dalai Lama and the 14th Dalai Lama had a wish that we must have contact with the international world. But unfortunately, from our own side, we were so blind and we knew nothing of the outside world. We were just so engrossed in our little pond, you know, so we knew nothing, what was happening to the world, what could happen, and so we lost our country.
The Dalai Lama advocates a middle way approach. He wants Tibetans to move back to Tibet, even though they have to be a minority within China. He remains determined that negotiations with the Chinese remain peaceful and positive.
Middle approach is the best. So present Chinese government policy regarding different minorities, particularly regarding Tibet, is not healthy or not good for long run. So kind of new opinions as a result of better awareness now coming. So therefore, basically, I'm hopeful. Thank you.